Hello and happy Wax on Wednesdays. Today I'm having a lot of fun with one of my favorite ways to work with encaustic, which surprisingly is paper. And I'm right here on the pancake griddle with little half sheets of just regular copy paper, and I'm only letting the paper absorb about 2/3 of coverage of that in clear encaustic medium. And I'm just dripping some clear encaustic medium right there on the griddle and letting the paper soak up about 2/3 worth of wax, and you can see all that white space that I have on that paper, and that's because I'm going to go ahead and apply some alcohol inks, and these are the Pinata alcohol inks, and they absorb all over the paper. You can layer them on top of the wax, but you can see on those blank areas that don't have the wax, they get nice and dark, and then they sort of tint the wax areas where the wax is on the paper, and it makes really exciting marks on this paper. I also found on some of the papers had some cells that were really interesting, and I haven't quite figured out where those came from yet, but it was really fun to explore how that alcohol ink really brought out the wax marks. And so it was fun to play around with different patterns of wax on that griddle and sort of get little drips and drops and things here and there, and then enhance them with those alcohol inks. And it was just a really fun process. And of course, that alcohol ink, when it absorbs into the copy paper itself, is so dark and beautiful. And you can layer on top the alcohol inks. You can continue to layer, and you can see where every time I fuse, I'm not adding another layer of wax, because this is paper, and we can't build up the layers like we normally would in an encaustic painting because it's paper, and eventually the wax would pop off of the paper. But a single layer of wax infused inside that paper is fine, and that's how I always work with paper, just letting that paper absorb as much as it wants to of that encaustic wax, and it gives that paper such a beautiful feeling. I can't tell you enough how much good paper feels when it's absorbed with wax. But you can see here that I'm layering that alcohol ink right on top, and then I go ahead and fuse it, and what I'm doing is reactivating that wax when I'm fusing. So if I begin to layer the pigments, the alcohol inks on top of each other, then every time I do that, I'm reactivating it by fusing it. And it sort of helps that alcohol ink, it absorbs the alcohol ink into the wax that's already on the paper and helps it set up and cure. And if you wanted to see all the supplies that I used this week, including the alcohol set that I used, it's all on the blog. Every single week, all the supplies that I used every week are on the blog post for the video that week, so you can easily see everything that I used for each video. And if you would like to come on an encaustic and paper journey with me, Encausticology Paper Journey online workshop has tons of projects of working with encaustic and lots of different papers in multiple ways with multiple mediums, multiple papers, making handmade papers, everything that you can possibly do with encaustic and paper. And in the end, we have several journals that we make from scratch. One of my favorite things to do with encaustic papers is create encaustic journals to house those papers. And we make several in Encausticology Paper Journey workshop to house all of these beautiful papers and make journals in completely different ways, completely handmade from scratch. And it is a lot of fun. So if you would like to join me in that workshop, you can join anytime and have lifetime access to any of the Encausticology online workshops. And I will put the link for all the details for that workshop below the video. So this last Inktober video ended up being sort of a wonderful surprise because I had something completely different to do for today's Wax on Wednesdays, and really fell in love with the way the alcohol ink was acting with this partially covered wax paper, and all of the wonderful marks and opportunities that were there for layering. It just really ended up, I fell in love with the process and had a lot of fun with it. So this ended up being a wonderful surprise for me too. And we can always do what I originally had planned next week in next week's Wax on Wednesdays video. So I just wanted to tell you also on these papers that if the ones that didn't have very much wax on them, I did put them back on the griddle just with a very sparse amount of encaustic medium, clear encaustic medium, and just let them absorb what they wanted. So they had an all over coverage once they were completed and painted. I did go ahead and not dip them, but just let them absorb just a little bit more wax so they had a complete coverage of wax in the end. And that way I can incorporate them easier into the journals because they had an even amount of coverage of wax. And so I made so many papers and had so much fun with the alcohol inks and the encaustic on this paper that I ended up making a journal for all of these papers. And that is one of my favorite things to do. Is it's a great way to keep everything together. And if you discover a process that you love with encaustic and paper, creating a journal for it is a wonderful way to look back at the techniques that you did and see them all together instead of letting them get lost somewhere in the studio, you know, hundreds of papers and how did I do this? You can actually keep track and actually write in your journal, maybe glue some other papers down and write what you did and what your process was so you can remember for future. And journals are just, of course, really beautiful to look at. So I hope that you really had fun and enjoyed this Wax on Wednesdays video, and I'm going to let you see the journal here in the end, how I housed them all in the journal, and I will see you next week on next week's Wax on Wednesdays. Happy Wax on Wednesday.